Welcome, dear literature enthusiasts, to this gathering of minds where cinema is not simply consumed but savored, unraveled, and interpreted like a poem or a novel that insists on being read again and again. I'm grateful you're here with me at Frame Shift, where we look at films not as disposable thrills, but as layered texts waiting to be explored. Before we wander into today's conversation, I'd like to gently ask that you subscribe if you haven't already, not as a formality, but as an invitation to continue these journeys together. Every click and every share helps keep this circle of thoughtful exploration alive, and I want us to keep pushing further into the stories that matter. And let me be clear from the start, this isn't a conventional movie review. It's not about stars or scores or deciding whether you should watch something this weekend. This is an intellectual and theoretical reflection, an analysis meant for those of you who approach cinema the way you approach literature, with curiosity, depth, and a desire to see what lies beneath the surface. The film on my mind today is A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge from 1985, and even saying its title conjures a strange set of emotions in me. When I first encountered it, I was both captivated and unsettled, not merely because of its imagery or its scares, but because of the odd, almost rebellious way it seemed to twist the expectations set by its predecessor. Watching it felt like entering a familiar room only to realize the furniture had been rearranged in the dark, creating a sense of disorientation and discovery. What struck me most, even then, was how daring it was to take a concept so defined in the original and to pull it in a new direction. That choice made it controversial for some, but for me it made the film fascinating. It was less a continuation than a reinvention, and that made me lean closer, curious to understand what it was trying to say. I remember being younger, watching it late at night, half hidden behind a blanket, and realizing I wasn't afraid in the way I expected to be. The scares didn't creep up on me the way they had in the first story. Instead, I felt a different kind of unease, something quieter, stranger, more psychological. It was as though the film wasn't content to chase me through dreams. It wanted to inhabit me, to push its way beneath the skin and linger there. That unsettled me in ways I couldn't quite articulate at the time, but later, when I returned to it as an older viewer, I recognized how much it was probing deeper questions about identity, repression, transformation, and the dangers of denying parts of ourselves. This wasn't just horror, it was allegory, even if that allegory emerged by accident or instinct rather than design. The film introduces us to Jesse, a teenager who has just moved into the house once occupied by Nancy, the heroine we follow before. Right away, the setting feels weighted with memory. It is as though the house itself carries the residue of what happened there, as if walls can absorb trauma the way the body absorbs scars. Jesse begins experiencing strange dreams, haunted not only by the figure who terrorized before, but also by a sense of possession. Unlike the earlier story, where dreams are the battleground, here dreams become doorways, passages through which something monstrous tries to push its way into waking life. The tension isn't only between hunter and hunted, it's between self and other, body and intruder, desire and fear. I've always been fascinated by this shift because it makes the story less about fleeing from terror and more about wrestling with it from within. Jesse isn't only chased, he is inhabited. The nightmares bleed into his waking moments, leaving him unable to trust his own mind or body. Watching that unfold, I couldn't help but think of times in my own life when I felt overtaken by something I couldn't name, when emotions or anxieties seemed to rise unbidden, as if from some dark well inside me. There's something deeply human about that idea, that horror isn't only external but internal, that we sometimes become vessels for what we fear. The plot itself builds gradually, layering moments of disorientation with bursts of violence that never quite feel like the earlier story's dream logic. Jesse begins to suspect that the terror haunting him isn't confined to sleep, that the figure he sees in his dreams is pushing through him, using him as a host. Strange deaths occur around him, and each time he fears he may be the one responsible. This inversion, where the protagonist is not simply fighting against evil, but also fearing he is the evil, is what makes the film so unique in the franchise. It shifts the genre from a story of survival into a story of possession, and in doing so, It opens itself to a wealth of symbolic readings. There's a moment that has stayed with me for years. Jesse, drenched in sweat, staring into the mirror as though searching for proof that he is still himself. That image resonates deeply because it captures the essence of adolescence, when identity feels unstable, when you look at your reflection and wonder who is really staring back. For me, this was always the most haunting part of the film. Not the claws or the screams, but the idea of being overtaken, of not recognizing yourself anymore. I think many of us, in quieter ways, know that feeling. We all carry fears we might not be entirely who we think we are, that hidden impulses might rise up and undo the lives we've carefully built. As the story escalates, Jesse becomes more and more isolated. His parents dismiss his fears. His friends sense something is wrong, but cannot grasp the depth of his torment. Even his budding romance feels fraught with tension, as though desire itself might open the door to what he's trying to suppress. This isolation gives the film its peculiar melancholy. Unlike Nancy, who rallied herself against an external force, Jesse feels abandoned, trapped in a war with himself. That difference makes the film divisive for some, but powerful for others. It's less about collective battle and more about personal implosion, and that shift creates a horror that is quieter but in many ways more intimate. The climactic moments are both grotesque and tragic. The figure bursts forth from Jesse in a transformation that is part body horror, part psychological allegory. It's not just a monster killing teenagers. It's a monster breaking through the boundaries of self. I remember watching this for the first time and feeling a mix of terror and sympathy, because Jesse was not a hero in the usual sense. He was fragile, confused, and overwhelmed, a vessel rather than a warrior. That vulnerability made the film resonate with me. It wasn't about victory or resilience in the traditional sense. It was about the horror of being consumed by what you fear, of being used as a conduit for violence you cannot control. What makes the film enduring in my memory isn't only the scares, but the themes it leaves behind. It speaks of repression and the dangers of denying parts of oneself. It whispers of generational curses, as trauma seems to cling to the house and transfer itself to new occupants. It suggests that evil isn't always an intruder from the outside, but something that can fester within, waiting for cracks in our defenses. These ideas made me think about my own life in new ways, about the things I tried to push down, the parts of myself I didn't want to face. The film reminded me that what we repress rarely disappears. It finds ways to return, often in distorted forms. And yet there's also a strange kind of beauty in that message. If horror shows us our shadows, it also reminds us that we cannot live by denying them. To survive, we must confront, acknowledge, and integrate the darker parts of ourselves. Watching Jesse struggle, even falter, I found myself reflecting on how often we all carry battles others can't see, and how easily those battles can make us feel alone. That recognition, that horror can reveal truths about our inner lives, made the film unforgettable to me. Of course, for those who come to the story looking for the familiar rhythm of dreams and slashing claws, the film can feel disorienting. It doesn't follow the same rules, doesn't repeat the same beats. But that's part of why I find it so compelling. It dares to explore new terrain, to ask new questions, even at the risk of alienating some. And for those of us willing to lean into its strangeness, it offers rewards that go beyond simple scares. It offers metaphors we can carry with us, symbols that resonate long after the credits roll. So, as we end this introduction and prepare to dive deeper into the layers of meaning, I invite you to linger with the unease this film creates. Think of Jesse staring into the mirror, wondering who he really is. Think of the house, holding on to the traumas of the past, passing them to those who come after. Think of the way desire, fear, and repression intertwine until they blur into nightmare. And let us carry these images not as simple scares, but as texts to be interpreted, as metaphors to be unpacked. For that is the gift of horror at its best. It frightens us into recognition, into seeing truths we might otherwise ignore. And that, to me, is worth more than any jump scare or fleeting thrill. It is why this film, strange and divisive as it may be, still lingers with me like a dream I can't quite shake. The first images arrive like a fever dream. A school bus winding its way through suburban streets, its yellow paint catching in the morning sun. A sound so familiar, it feels almost comforting. Children shuffle in, laughing, calling out to one another, their voices bouncing against the windows. Jesse sits among them, his face a mask of that particular teenage uncertainty, caught between the desire to blend in and the fear of being noticed. The scene seems ordinary, almost banal, until something shifts, so subtle at first you might think you imagined it. The road grows narrow, the chatter of children fades into silence, and the driver does not stop. The bus veers away from its route, plunging into a barren stretch of desert land, the ground breaking away until the bus itself teeters above a pit. And there, at the wheel, sits the figure Jesse had never wished to see. The bus tips, the children scream, and just before it all collapses, Jesse awakens, drenched in sweat. That opening dream sets the tone for everything to come. Reality fragile, safety illusory, nightmares intruding where order once ruled. From a moment Jesse wakes in his new bedroom, a room still haunted by the memories of its previous occupant, it's clear that something clings to this house, something that will not rest. The sheets stick to his body with sweat. The air feels stifling, and though he tells himself it's just a dream, the unease lingers like a film on his skin. This bedroom is not a sanctuary. It is a vessel for echoes he cannot name, and as he rises from his bed, the morning light offers no comfort. The house itself becomes a character early on, its creaks and shadows suggesting a memory older than Jesse's time there. Boxes still half unpacked, his parents moving through the motions of settling in, all the while ignoring the strange energy that seems to hum beneath the walls. It is a classic suburban home on the outside, but its history presses against the edges of the new family's attempts at normalcy. For Jesse, the house feels like an inheritance he never wanted, a place chosen for him where past horrors still breathe. At school, Jesse moves through the uneasy rhythms of adolescence, his sweat-soaked mornings leaving him groggy and distracted. He finds a tentative connection with Lisa, a bright, curious girl who senses something off about him, yet chooses not to pull away. Their bond feels delicate, tentative, a lifeline Jesse doesn't fully know how to grasp. The chemistry class they share, the awkward laughter exchanged, the slow warmth of companionship, all of it is tinged with an undercurrent of dread. Jesse's mind is elsewhere, haunted by images he cannot shake. The dreams continue, each one peeling back another layer of reality. Shadows lengthen in hallways where no one should be walking. Whispers call his name when the house is silent. In one dream, he finds himself descending into a boiler room, pipes hissing around him, walls sweating with heat. And there, lurking in the glow of fire and steam, the scarred figure steps forward, not chasing but waiting, patient and deliberate. Unlike the faceless terrors of other nightmares, this one is precise, personal, as though the figure knows Jesse intimately. Jesse awakens again, heart hammering, and begins to suspect the truth. The dreams are not merely dreams. They are invitations. Strange things start happening in the waking world. Objects heat up without warning. A toaster bursts into flame, though it isn't plugged in. His father shrugs it off, frustrated at Jesse's unease, while his mother hovers with concern she cannot quite express. This dismissal by his parents pushes Jesse further into isolation. The house isn't simply haunted, it is unacknowledged, and that makes its grip on him even tighter. At school, Jesse's unease begins to draw attention. A confrontation in gym class leads to a fight with Grady, a brash classmate who mocks him until fists fly. Yet from that clash, an odd friendship forms. Grady, once an antagonist, becomes an ally of sorts, though one laced with tension and distrust. The dynamic between them is marked by competitiveness, but beneath it is the recognition that both boys are caught in the restless uncertainty of adolescence. Still, Jesse cannot share the full truth of what he's experiencing, even with Grady. The nights grow worse. Jesse dreams of the scarred man handing him a glove, an object tipped with blades, cold and heavy. The figure tells him that he needs Jesse, that through Jesse he will return. This moment is more than a dream. It is a proposition, a seduction. The terror lies not in being hunted, but in being chosen, in realizing that he is not merely a victim, but a vessel. Jesse wakes, trembling, the impression of the glove still burning in his mind. He tells himself it isn't real, yet when he opens his drawer, he finds the glove lying there. It is proof, undeniable and grotesque, that the boundary between dream and waking has shattered. Lisa notices Jesse's decline. She tries to draw him out, urging him to talk, suggesting they spend more time together. Her warmth offers him moments of reprieve, but the darkness continues to encroach. At a pool party, Jesse struggles to stay present, his eyes constantly flicking to shadows, to the edges of light where he fears the figure may appear. The normal rituals of teenage life, music, laughter, awkward flirting, feel alien to him, as though he's moving through someone else's dream. Back at home, the house continues to betray him. The heat grows unbearable, the thermostat spinning out of control. At night, Jesse is drawn to the basement, compelled by whispers only he can hear. The scarred man appears again, more vivid than ever, telling him that his body is the doorway, that together they can make the nightmares real. Jesse resists, but his resistance falters. Each encounter leaves him weaker, less certain of his own will. He begins to doubt himself, to fear that he is already lost. The tension reaches a breaking point when Jesse, overwhelmed by his torment, flees into the night. He wanders into a bar, the neon lights buzzing overhead, seeking escape in noise and strangers. There he is found by his gym teacher, a strict and domineering figure who drags him back to the school for punishment. What unfolds is one of the most surreal sequences of the film. The teacher forces Jesse into the showers, the sound of water echoing against tile, and then the lights flicker. Lockers slam shut of their own accord. Ropes snake out like serpents, and Jesse finds himself overtaken by a force he cannot control. When the scarred figure appears, Jesse realizes with horror that he is the one wielding the glove. The teacher's screams reverberate as blood runs across the tiles, and Jesse collapses, horrified by what he has done, or believes he has done. The next morning, the town is buzzing with whispers of the teacher's death. Jesse, hollow-eyed, staggers through school, unable to meet anyone's gaze. He knows the truth, even if no one else does. The figure is using him, stepping through him to kill in the waking world. His body is not his own, and his nightmares have spilled outward, staining reality. Lisa, sensing his unraveling, presses him for answers. She reads old diaries left behind by the house's previous occupant, piecing together the fragments of the story. She realizes that Jesse is not alone, that what he faces has haunted others before. But Jesse cannot take comfort in this knowledge. He feels cursed, marked, incapable of escape. As the days pass, Jesse's grip on himself loosens further. He lashes out at Grady, withdraws from Lisa, and stares into mirrors as though expecting another face to stare back. His parents, bewildered and impatient, argue over what to do with him. His father insists he needs discipline. His mother pleads for compassion, but neither sees the truth. The real battle is not one they can fight for him. It is inside him, relentless and consuming. The dreams and waking world intertwine until Jesse cannot tell them apart. He stands in his room and hears the hiss of the boiler. He closes his eyes in class and finds himself holding the glove. He reaches out to Lisa for comfort, but fears that touching her might unleash the thing inside him. Each moment becomes a test, each breath a reminder that he is not entirely in control. The horror has ceased to be about what hunts him, it is about what he might become. And so, the story builds to its midpoint not with clarity, but with collapse. Jesse, once just a teenager navigating new beginnings, is now fractured, trapped between two identities. The house watches, the glove waits, and the scarred figure whispers in his dreams, patient as ever. The question is no longer whether Jesse can survive, but whether he can remain himself at all. That is the terror of this story, not being killed but being consumed. Jesse's unraveling begins to accelerate, and with it, the fragile sense of control he once tried to cling to. By now, the nights have become indistinguishable from the days. Sleep no longer provides rest. Instead, it drags him further into the grip of the scarred figure who waits in the shadows of every dream. Waking life offers no escape, for everywhere Jesse looks, he sees traces of that presence. Reflections in windows, movements in the corners of rooms, whispers that crawl beneath his skin. He tries to reassure himself that he is still himself, but each day it grows harder to believe. The horror of possession deepens when Jesse begins to realize he is not just haunted, but hollowed out. The figure has chosen him as a vessel, and with each passing night, the bond strengthens. When Jesse tries to resist, the voice in his head grows louder, promising power, promising release, promising that together they can transcend the fragile boundaries of fear. This struggle between self and invader is the heart of the story, and as it intensifies, Jesse isolates himself further. The more his friends and family reach out, the more he recoils, afraid of what might happen if he lets them too close. Lisa remains his only anchor, though even she feels the strain. She scours the journals and diaries she found, pages that whisper of past battles with the same scarred monster, written by the girl who once lived in Jesse's house. Through those words, Lisa begins to piece together the truth. The figure is not bound to dreams alone. It is fueled by fear, by repression, by whatever fractures exist inside those it chooses. She believes Jesse can fight it, but Jesse himself doubts. The more Lisa insists that he still has a choice, the more he fears that choice has already been taken from him. The story takes a darker turn with Jesse's relationship to Grady, his friend turned reluctant confidant. After an evening where Jesse feels himself on the brink of losing control, he flees from Lisa's presence, terrified that the figure inside him might hurt her. He turns instead to Grady, desperate for someone to keep watch as he tries to fight off the possession. In Grady's room, the tension between the two boys is palpable, part camaraderie, part suspicion, part something deeper left unspoken. Jesse begs Grady not to let him fall asleep, not to let the figure take over. But exhaustion is merciless. His eyelids close, his body betrays him. And when he awakens, it is not Jesse but the scarred monster who steps forward, bursting out in a grotesque metamorphosis. Grady screams, trapped in his own bedroom, but his strength is no match. By the time the horror subsides, Grady is dead, and Jesse, staring at his blood-soaked hands, realizes the monster has used him once more. This moment becomes the breaking point. Jesse runs, his guilt overwhelming, his mind fractured beyond repair. He stumbles back to Lisa, confessing what he has done, confessing that he can no longer trust himself. Lisa, shaken but resolute, insists that she still believes in him, that she can reach whatever part of him remains untouched. But even as she speaks, the scarred figure flickers at the edges of her vision, as though Jesse is fading and the intruder is taking his place. The conflict between love and terror intensifies, turning their bond into the story's last fragile defense against collapse. The setting shifts to Lisa's home, where a pool party unfolds in stark contrast to the horror brewing in Jesse's mind. Teenagers laugh, music pounds, the air is filled with the smell of grilled food and chlorine. For a moment, it almost feels like normalcy has returned. But Jesse cannot hold it together. He trembles, drenched in sweat, his eyes darting as though shadows are circling him. Lisa tries to calm him, to draw him back, but it is too late. The figure erupts, not in a dream, but in waking life, breaking through Jesse completely. The massacre at the pool party is one of the story's most infamous sequences because it breaks the rules. No longer confined to dreams, the scarred monster walks openly among terrified teenagers. The symbolism is stark: repression, fear, and violence no longer hidden, but made flesh before everyone. Chaos explodes as he cuts through the crowd. Teenagers scrambling over fences, flames erupting, screams tearing into the night. The pool, once a symbol of leisure, becomes a mirror for panic, its waters reflecting the carnage above. And yet, even amid the bloodshed, there are moments where Jesse flickers through, moments where Lisa sees him struggling inside the monster's eyes, begging to be freed. The figure, now fully manifested, retreats into the industrial hell of the boiler room, the place where it feels most at home. Lisa, driven by determination, follows. She knows that Jesse is still in there somewhere, that he has not been entirely consumed. The boiler room becomes the stage for their final confrontation, a place dripping with heat and shadow, pipes groaning like the bones of some mechanical beast. Lisa faces the monster, not with weapons but with words, calling out to Jesse, reminding him of who he is, pleading for him to resist. At first, it seems futile. The monster snarls, lashes out, revels in its power. Flames roar around them, the air thick with smoke and heat. Lisa stumbles, screams, and yet she does not stop. She presses closer, insisting that she knows Jesse is still inside, that he can fight. In one of the film's most striking images, she kisses him, an act of defiance, of love, of hope that connection can pierce through possession. For a heartbeat, the monster falters. The claws waver, the scarred face twists with confusion, and then, with a scream that rattles the boiler room to its core, the figure collapses. Flames engulf it, tearing it apart, leaving behind only ash and silence. Jesse emerges from the wreckage, trembling, broken, but alive. The figure is gone, or so it seems. Lisa holds him, reassuring him that it is over, that he has reclaimed himself. Their escape from the boiler room feels like an exhalation, the nightmare finally releasing its grip. The daylight that follows seems brighter than before, a fragile promise of safety. And yet, the story does not end in certainty. On the school bus once again, Jesse sits among his classmates, Lisa nearby, laughter drifting through the air. It feels almost like a return to normalcy, a circle closing where it began. But unease lingers. The bus veers slightly, the laughter fades, and for an instant, the possibility of nightmare returning hovers in the air. The scarred figure's presence is not entirely gone. It is memory, shadow, suggestion. The story leaves us suspended in ambiguity, wondering whether Jesse is truly free or whether the monster still waits, patient and eternal, in the recesses of his mind. What unfolds in these closing movements is not resolution, but reflection. The story has not promised victory so much as survival, not eradication so much as endurance. Jesse's struggle is not about destroying the darkness, but about facing it, about discovering that what haunts us cannot always be killed. It can only be resisted, contained, or understood. The figure is more than a villain. It is a symbol of fear itself, of repression given flesh, of the shadows we carry and the battles we fight within. As the credits would eventually roll, the audience is left unsettled, caught between relief and dread. The nightmare has been confronted, but it has not been erased. And that lingering uncertainty is what makes the story endure. The recognition that nightmares, like the fears they embody, never truly end. They return again and again, reshaped but familiar, reminding us that the line between waking and dreaming, between self and shadow, is never as solid as we want it to be. Jesse Walsh stands at the heart of the story, a character both fragile and fierce, though often unsure which of those qualities belongs to him and which is forced upon him. He is not a hero in the traditional mold, not someone who seeks confrontation or even wants to step into the spotlight. Instead, he is thrust into it, pushed there by circumstance, by the unlucky choice of a house still heavy with trauma, and by the relentless shadow of something that refuses to stay buried. Watching Jesse, we see a portrait of adolescence in turmoil, confusion, vulnerability, the longing to belong, and the terror of not knowing whether the feelings inside are truly your own. He is written as every teenager's fear embodied, the idea that something alien, dark, and uncontainable might live within you, waiting to break free. His sweat-soaked nights, his jittery movements, his inability to explain to others what he feels. It all paints the picture of someone cracking under the weight of secrets. What makes Jesse compelling is his lack of archetypal power. He doesn't charge toward destiny like Nancy before him, armed with wit and discipline. Instead, he flounders. He resists and then succumbs. He panics and then apologizes. He seeks comfort only to withdraw in shame. This fragility makes him real, and it makes his possession all the more tragic. The scarred figure uses him not because Jesse is strong, but because he is vulnerable, because his uncertainties create cracks through which the nightmare can slip. That, in itself, is symbolic of adolescence. Jesse is the embodiment of a teenager who has yet to solidify his identity, who can be overtaken by external pressures and internal battles alike. His performance throughout is marked by desperation, by the constant flicker of fear in his eyes, and by the rare, fleeting moments when tenderness, toward Lisa, toward friendship, shines through the cracks. Lisa Weber becomes Jesse's counterpart, the tether that keeps him from dissolving completely into the nightmare's grip. She is not the final girl in the traditional sense, nor is she framed as a victim waiting to be saved. Instead, she is written as the one who chooses to save, who insists that her belief in Jesse is stronger than the darkness threatening to consume him. Lisa's strength lies in her persistence, her refusal to abandon Jesse even when logic tells her he is lost. There's a quiet bravery in her character. She doesn't fight with weapons or traps. She fights with compassion, with the insistence that identity can be preserved through love and trust. In this way, she becomes the moral center of the film. Her willingness to walk into the boiler room, to face a monster born of fire and shadows with nothing but her voice and her faith, transforms her from mere supporting character into the narrative soul. And yet, Lisa is not without complexity. Her attachment to Jesse could be read as romantic devotion, but also reflects her own anxieties about connection and abandonment. She clings to him not only because she cares, but because letting go would mean accepting that the nightmare wins. She is less a passive love interest and more a symbol of the refusal to surrender to fear. In her, we see the idea that relationships, whether romantic, platonic, or simply human, are what keep us tethered when our inner battles threaten to sever us from ourselves. Ron Grady, Jesse's uneasy ally, is a fascinating study in contradictions. Introduced as a bully, a cocky classmate quick to mock and quicker to fight, he transforms unexpectedly into Jesse's confidant. Their dynamic is strange, volatile, and tinged with an intimacy neither boy fully understands. Grady's sarcasm and bravado mask his uncertainty, his inability to process the vulnerability Jesse shows him. And yet, beneath the bravado, he provides Jesse with something crucial: companionship in isolation. He becomes the one Jesse turns to when he feels most afraid, the one he trusts enough to say, "Don't let me fall asleep." Grady's role is brief but pivotal, and his death, violent, sudden, and tragically preventable, carries symbolic weight. It is the destruction of trust, the erasure of friendship by forces too great for either to control. Grady is not just another victim. He is a reminder that even bonds forged in unlikely places can be ripped apart when fear takes over. Jesse's parents are not central figures in terms of screen time, but symbolically they loom large. His father embodies the archetype of authority, dismissive and blind, quick to scold and slow to understand. He sees Jesse's unraveling as laziness, as a lack of discipline, as something to be corrected rather than comprehended. In him, the film critiques a generational divide, the inability of adults to truly grasp the battles of their children, preferring to impose order rather than listen. Jesse's mother, on the other hand, represents concern that is genuine but powerless. She senses something wrong. She reaches out with gentleness, but her efforts fall short because she cannot pierce the veil of Jesse's inner turmoil. Together, the parents symbolize the larger failure of adult authority in the film. They cannot protect Jesse because they cannot see him. Their blindness allows the nightmare to flourish, just as the denial of parents in the earlier story allowed the monster to rise in the first place. Coach Schneider, Jesse's gym teacher, is a character who at first seems peripheral but becomes critical in shaping one of the film's most disturbing sequences. His cruelty in the gym, his domineering presence, and his insistence on control reflect another form of authority gone wrong. He is not protective but abusive, and his death at the hands of the monster, channeled through Jesse, is loaded with symbolism. It represents not only Jesse's fear of authority, but also the destructive consequences of repression, both personal and societal. Schneider's death, with its surreal and grotesque staging, is one of the clearest expressions of the film's willingness to blur the line between external horror and internal allegory. He is not just a victim, but a stand-in for oppressive forces that haunt Jesse's psyche. And then there is the scarred figure himself, the returning nightmare whose presence defines the narrative. Unlike in the earlier story, where he hunted through dreams, here his role shifts. He becomes less of a stalker and more of a parasite, less interested in chasing than in inhabiting. His relationship with Jesse is not that of predator and prey, but of master and vessel. He seduces, tempts, and whispers promises of power. In this sense, he is both monster and metaphor, a figure who embodies repressed fears, forbidden desires, and the shadow self. His burned skin, his bladed glove, his sardonic laughter, all remain intact, but they carry new weight in this context. He is no longer confined to dreams. He has found a doorway into waking life through Jesse, and that shift makes him both more terrifying and more symbolic. He represents the idea that what we fear most is not external, but internal, not distant, but already within us. The secondary characters, the classmates, the partygoers, the figures who populate Jesse's world, serve as mirrors to his isolation. They laugh, flirt, and live with the ease of those who still believe the world is safe. Their presence at the pool party, their screams when the nightmare emerges, underline the contrast between ordinary adolescence and Jesse's unique torment. They are not developed in depth because they are not meant to be. They exist as symbols of the life Jesse cannot fully participate in, the normalcy that slips further from his grasp as the story unfolds. Taken together, these characters form a constellation of themes. Jesse embodies vulnerability and repression. Lisa embodies compassion and connection. Grady embodies trust shattered by forces beyond control. Jesse's parents embody the blindness of authority, while Coach Schneider embodies the cruelty of it. And the scarred figure embodies the darkness we repress, the fears we deny, the violence that waits beneath the surface. The interactions between these characters are not just narrative beats. They're symbolic confrontations between innocence and corruption, love and fear, denial and acknowledgement. What makes this character ensemble fascinating is how they reflect broader truths about adolescence and trauma. Each one, in their way, mirrors an aspect of Jesse's struggle. His father's dismissal reflects the fear of not being heard. His mother's helpless concern reflects the inadequacy of comfort when the problem runs deeper than words. Lisa's persistence reflects the hope that someone will stand by us, even when we cannot stand by ourselves. Grady's companionship reflects the importance and fragility of trust, and the scarred figure reflects the inevitability of confronting what we fear within. The performances themselves contribute to these themes. Mark Patton, as Jesse, plays vulnerability with raw intensity, his sweat-drenched, frantic portrayal making the horror feel physical, almost tactile. Kim Myers, as Lisa, brings warmth and determination, grounding the story in emotional truth. Robert Rusler's Grady carries the cocky swagger that masks deeper humanity, making his death more tragic. Marshall Bell, as Coach Schneider, infuses his role with menace that makes his downfall feel both shocking and inevitable. And Robert Englund, returning as the scarred figure, leans into the role with a mixture of menace and sardonic wit, reminding us that monsters are most terrifying when they're not only brutal, but charismatic. By the time the story ends, the characters are no longer simply individuals, but archetypes, symbols woven into a larger allegory. They remind us that horror is not just about what lurks in shadows, but about what lives within us. Our fears of failure, of rejection, of being misunderstood, of losing ourselves. Each character, in their way, embodies those fears, making the film not just a story of possession, but a story of adolescence itself. What lingers after examining these characters is not only their fates, but their meanings. Jesse's struggle is the struggle of becoming oneself in the face of overwhelming pressure. Lisa's devotion is the reminder that love can tether us when fear threatens to sever us. Grady's loss is the reminder that trust is fragile, that even the strongest bonds can be broken by forces beyond our control. The parent's blindness is the reminder that generational silence breeds trauma. And the scarred figure is the reminder that repression, denial, and fear will always return, demanding to be faced. Together, they create a story that resonates not just as horror, but as allegory. It is not simply about a monster terrorizing a boy. It is about identity, repression, connection, and the eternal struggle between the self we hope to be and the shadows we fear we are. That is the power of these characters. They live beyond their roles, embodying truths that continue to haunt us long after the screen goes dark. What makes this film so fascinating is not only the story it tells on screen, but also the strange, tangled, often unbelievable story of how it came to be. To watch it is to see nightmares made flesh, but to look behind the curtain is to see another kind of nightmare, one born of clashing visions, strange accidents, quiet rebellions, and unexpected legacies. The making of the film is almost as eerie as its plot. It is filled with odd coincidences, choices that defied convention, and little-known facts that continue to surprise even longtime fans. When you sift through these details, it becomes clear that the movie itself is haunted, not by a fictional monster, but by the strange alchemy of its production. The first strange fact is one that defines the film's entire identity. Wes Craven, the creator of the original Nightmare, wanted nothing to do with its sequel. After the explosive success of the first story, the studio was eager to capitalize on its popularity, but Craven resisted. He envisioned the original as self-contained, its ending ambiguous but final. When asked to direct the sequel, he declined, citing creative differences and a refusal to stretch the premise into something he believed would cheapen it. His absence created a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped director Jack Sholder, who approached the project with very different instincts. Sholder leaned less on surreal dreamscapes and more on psychological possession, reshaping the mythology into something darker, stranger, and far more divisive. The casting of Jesse Walsh is itself a piece of film history. Mark Patton, the young actor chosen for the role, became the franchise's first male protagonist, a rarity in a genre dominated by the archetype of the final girl. At the time, this didn't seem radical, but in hindsight, it transformed the film into something unique. The narrative of possession and internal struggle resonated with themes of identity and repression, themes that critics and fans later recognized as distinctly queer-coded. Patton himself, a gay actor navigating Hollywood during the AIDS crisis, found his own life intersecting with the film's subtext in ways that were both painful and prophetic. In later years, Patton would describe the film as his own gay nightmare, a strange collision of art and life that became the defining chapter of his career. The queer subtext of the film is one of its most infamous facts. At the time of its release, audiences noticed something unusual in the story's dynamics. The lingering camera shots of Jesse's sweat-drenched body, the strange intimacy of his relationship with Grady, the surreal scene of Jesse encountering his domineering gym teacher in a leather bar before a grotesque shower room death. Critics and fans alike began to see the film not only as horror, but as metaphor, a story about repressed desire, about fear of identity, about sexuality lurking in shadows like a monster waiting to emerge. What makes this fact stranger still is the way the filmmakers themselves handled it. Screenwriter David Chaskin initially denied that the subtext was intentional, blaming Patton's performance for what he called homoerotic undertones. Years later, however, he admitted that he had indeed written those themes deliberately, hoping to smuggle them into the story. For Patton, this revelation was bittersweet, proof that he had not imagined the layers, but also a reminder that he had been unfairly blamed for them during a time when Hollywood was quick to punish. The infamous shower scene is another behind-the-scenes oddity that has become the stuff of legend. Marshall Bell, who played Coach Schneider, was cast as the cruel gym teacher whose private life is hinted at in a sequence where Jesse encounters him in a leather bar. What followed was one of the most bizarre deaths in the franchise. Ropes whip across the locker room, dragging Schneider into the showers, where he is stripped naked and assaulted by unseen forces before being clawed to death. Filming this sequence was as awkward as it sounds. Bell later admitted that he had no idea what he was signing up for, and that shooting the scene required him to spend hours restrained and exposed under the harsh glare of studio lights. Crew members joked nervously about the absurdity of it all, while Patton, standing nearby, recalled how surreal it felt to watch one of the strangest deaths in horror history unfold. One fact often overlooked is how quickly the sequel was made. The first film debuted in 1984, and by 1985, the sequel was already in theaters. The turnaround was rushed, driven by the studio's fear of losing momentum. This haste left little time for reflection, rewriting, or careful planning. Special effects were cobbled together under pressure, scripts were revised on the fly, and scenes were often shot with little clarity about how they would fit into the final product. That chaotic energy is part of what gives the film its jagged, uneven tone. It feels less polished than its predecessor, less dreamlike, but more feverish, as though the film itself is caught in the throes of possession. The Pool Party Massacre, one of the film's most infamous sequences, is another example of how the rules of the story were broken in ways that unsettled fans. Up until this point, the mythology had been clear. The nightmare figure struck in dreams, in the intimate spaces of unconsciousness. Yet in this scene, he bursts into waking life, attacking a crowd of teenagers at a backyard pool party. The imagery is chaotic, flames erupting, bodies scrambling, a monster visible to dozens of witnesses. For many fans, this defied the internal logic of the story, tearing down the fragile boundary between dreams and reality. Behind the scenes, the sequence was just as chaotic. Shooting it required wrangling dozens of extras, choreographing panicked escapes, and staging explosions in suburban backyards. Some neighbors reportedly called the police, mistaking the fiery chaos for a real emergency. For years afterward, the pool scene became a point of debate, bold innovation or betrayal of the franchise's rules. The first major rupture in Jesse's waking world occurs with the death of Coach Schneider. This sequence has been the subject of endless analysis, not only because of its bizarre staging, but because of what it represents. Jesse's encounter with his gym teacher in a leather bar, followed by the grotesque shower room death, has been interpreted as one of the most overtly queer-coded moments in mainstream horror at the time. Critics note how the scene stages Jesse's repression and fear of desire through the figure of Schneider, who embodies authority, control, and hidden sexuality. The ropes that bind him, the water that scalds, the claws that slash, all function as metaphors for the violence of repression. From a symbolic standpoint, Jesse does not simply witness the death. He enacts it, his body becoming the vessel through which the monster manifests. Scholars argue that this scene encapsulates the film's central allegory, the fear of forbidden desire overtaking the self, transforming longing into violence. Lisa's role becomes increasingly important as Jesse's unraveling deepens. From a critical perspective, Lisa represents more than just the archetypal love interest. She is the embodiment of compassion and the possibility of connection. In scenes where she tries to anchor Jesse, whether at school, at the pool party, or in the climactic boiler room, her persistence is often read as a challenge to the isolating effects of repression. Some critics argue that Lisa's belief in Jesse reflects the broader theme of empathy as resistance. Where Jesse's father dismisses him, where Grady mocks him before befriending him, where authority figures fail him, Lisa insists on seeing him, insisting that his identity is not reducible to the monster inside. In this sense, Lisa is the moral counterweight to the nightmare. Her presence a reminder that survival may depend not on defeating darkness, but on being recognized in the midst of it. The dynamic between Jesse and Grady has inspired perhaps the most discussion among critics. Their relationship begins in antagonism, Grady mocking Jesse, their confrontation in gym class, but evolves into an intimacy rare in male friendships depicted in 1980s horror. The scene where Jesse confides in Grady, asking him to watch over him as he tries to resist the possession, is often cited as one of the film's most charged moments. The vulnerability Jesse displays, the trust he places in Grady, and the fatal outcome that follows have been read as allegorical. Queer theorists interpret the intimacy between the boys as symbolic of closeted desire, while others see it as a broader metaphor for trust destroyed by forces beyond control. Grady's death, gruesome and sudden, is not just another kill in the franchise. It is a rupture of trust, a symbolic punishment for intimacy in a culture that, at the time, often viewed such bonds with suspicion. The pool party massacre stands as the most controversial event in the film, both narratively and critically. By stepping fully into waking life, the monster breaks the central rule established by the first story. To some critics, this was a betrayal of the mythology, a flattening of what made the nightmare so compelling. To others, however, this rupture is precisely what makes the film unique. By allowing the monster to manifest openly, the film externalizes repression, showing it not as a private struggle, but as a collective one. The flames that erupt, the screams of dozens of witnesses, the chaos of teenagers fleeing across suburban lawns, all symbolize the contagion of fear, the way repression, once unleashed, spreads uncontrollably. Scholars often note the irony of this scene. At a party meant to celebrate adolescence, freedom, and desire, repression manifests as carnage. The pool, a symbol of leisure and community, becomes a mirror reflecting panic and dissolution. Lisa's confrontation in the boiler room is perhaps the most symbolically loaded event in the film. Unlike Nancy before her, Lisa does not build traps or rely on logic. Instead, she confronts the monster with words, with compassion, with the insistence that Jesse is still inside. Critics have interpreted this as a radical act. Rather than seeking to destroy the darkness, she seeks to redeem the light still flickering within it. The kiss she places on the monster, often cited as one of the strangest and most debated moments in the film, has been read through multiple lenses, as an allegory for love, overcoming fear, as a problematic reinforcement of romantic salvation, or as a symbolic gesture of integration, the acceptance of a shadow self. Whatever the interpretation, the moment is unforgettable. Flames consume the figure, and Jesse emerges, trembling but alive. And yet, the conclusion denies closure. The return to the school bus, the laughter of classmates, the sudden veer into unease, it all suggests that the nightmare is not gone, merely dormant. Critics have long debated this ending. Some see it as a cynical attempt to keep the franchise open for sequels, while others argue that it is thematically consistent. Repression cannot be erased with a single act of will. Nightmares linger, resurface, and mutate. This refusal to provide resolution is what gives the film its haunting resonance. It tells us that survival does not mean triumph, that identity is not secured once and for all, and that fear always waits just beneath the surface. The reception of these events was shaped by the cultural moment in which the film was released. In 1985, the AIDS crisis loomed large, casting a shadow of fear over queer communities and shaping how audiences interpreted the film's subtext. Jesse's possession, his fear of desire, his isolation, and the destruction of those closest to him resonated as metaphors for the stigmas of the time. Critics initially dismissed the film as incoherent or campy, but in later years, scholars reclaimed it as a text rich with allegory. Its events, once seen as failures of logic, became recognized as bold experiments in symbolic storytelling. The emotional resonance of these events lies in their intimacy. Unlike the detached dreamscapes of the first story, this film's events feel sweaty, suffocating, embodied. Jesse's struggle is not abstract. It is physical, visceral, written on his skin and in his trembling voice. Lisa's persistence, Grady's trust, Schneider's cruelty, the pool party's chaos. All of these events remind us that horror is not only about death but about relationships, about the bonds that sustain or destroy us. Special effects added their own layer of strangeness. The transformation sequences, where Jesse's body literally splits to allow the monster to emerge, were achieved with a mixture of prosthetics, animatronics, and practical effects that were both groundbreaking and grotesque. One sequence required Patton to wear a chest piece that split open, with a mechanical puppet clawing its way through. The heat on set was unbearable, the prosthetics heavy and suffocating. Crew members described how Patton emerged drenched in sweat, gasping for air, his exhaustion mirroring Jesse's torment. The effect, though, was stunning. Critics may have debated the film's narrative, but they could not deny the visceral power of its body horror. Perhaps one of the strangest trivia pieces is how divided the cast and crew were about what they were making. Some treated it as a straightforward horror film, others whispered about its subtext, and still others dismissed it entirely as pulp. Robert Englund, returning as the scarred figure, leaned into the role with relish, delivering his lines with sardonic flair and injecting moments of dark humor into the menace. Yet even he admitted that the film felt different, stranger, less grounded in the dream logic of the first. Jack Sholder, the director, defended his choices as bold experimentation, while critics later accused him of misunderstanding the essence of the franchise. That divide is still felt today, with fans either dismissing the film as an outlier or embracing it as a bold, queer allegory that set it apart. The legacy of the film is perhaps its strangest fact of all. Upon release, it was panned by critics and rejected by many fans of the original. Its box office performance was solid but unremarkable, and for years it was treated as the black sheep of the series. Yet over time, it began to be reinterpreted. LGBTQ+ audiences found in Jesse's story a reflection of their own struggles with identity and repression. Film scholars began writing essays about its queer coding, its subversive imagery, its daring to explore possession as metaphor for closeted desire. What was once dismissed as a failure became, in hindsight, a cult classic. It is now studied not only as a horror sequel, but as a cultural artifact, a film that accidentally, or perhaps deliberately, captured the anxieties of its era. Mark Patton's story adds one final layer of strangeness. After the film's release, he found himself typecast, criticized, and cornered by a Hollywood that was hostile to openly gay actors. He left the industry, retreating into obscurity, his career seemingly ended by the very film that had promised to launch it. Decades later, however, he returned, embraced by a new generation of fans who saw him not as a failure, but as a pioneer. Documentaries were made about his journey, and he spoke candidly about the ways the film had mirrored his own struggles with identity, fear, and resilience. What once seemed like a curse became, in a strange twist of fate, a source of empowerment. When you look at all these facts together, the film becomes something more than a sequel. It is a story haunted by absence. Wes Craven's absence, Mark Patton's retreat from Hollywood, the absence of clear rules. It is a story marked by accidents and strangeness, rushed production, chaotic effects, neighbors mistaking explosions for real danger. It is a story loaded with symbolism, some intended, some discovered later. And it is a story whose legacy has shifted like a dream, once dismissed, now reclaimed, its strangeness reinterpreted as brilliance. That is the enduring truth of this film, that its strangest facts are not footnotes, but part of its essence. They remind us that art is not made in straight lines, but in crooked, haunted paths. They remind us that sometimes the accidents, the arguments, the odd choices, and the misunderstood performances are what give a film its soul. And they remind us that what is dismissed in one era can become essential in another. That nightmares, like truths, often take time to reveal their meaning. This film may have been born in haste and received with disdain, but in its strangeness it found something timeless. A mirror for repression, a metaphor for identity, and a legacy that continues to ripple through horror history. The very first moments of the film announce themselves with a peculiar intensity. The school bus, so ordinary and safe in its symbolism, becomes the setting for one of the most unsettling opening sequences in horror. Critics often point to this opening as a statement of intent, a shift away from the dream logic of the earlier story into something more feverish, more bodily. The bus leaves the suburban streets and hurtles into a barren wasteland where the ground falls away, leaving the vehicle teetering over an abyss. For Jesse, trapped inside, the terror is immediate and physical. From a critical perspective, this sequence establishes the central theme, the intrusion of nightmare into the structures of everyday life. Unlike the first story, where dreams were separated from waking life, this nightmare spills outward, transforming familiar rituals, like the ride to school, into sites of danger. Scholars have noted how this imagery reflects the fragility of adolescence, the realization that even the routines meant to carry you safely from one stage of life to another can collapse under unseen weight. When Jesse awakens, drenched in sweat, the film pivots into a new kind of horror, the horror of embodiment. His body, slick with perspiration, restless in his sheets, becomes the first battlefield. Critics have drawn attention to the way the camera lingers on Jesse's body in ways unusual for male protagonists in horror, turning him into an object of vulnerability and desire. From a psychoanalytic viewpoint, these early images suggest that the nightmare is not only external but internal, that Jesse's struggle is not just against a monster, but against his own body, his own identity, his own repression. The sweat, the trembling, the restless nights, all symbolize the turbulence of adolescence, when the body itself feels alien, unpredictable, even hostile. The house, inherited from the earlier story, serves as a repository of memory. It is not simply a backdrop, but a character in itself, one that critics often interpret as a metaphor for generational trauma. Nancy's story may have ended, but the house retains its residue, passing it on to Jesse and his family. The strange heat that builds within, the unexplained malfunctions, the constant sense of surveillance. These are not random hauntings, but symbolic manifestations of history repeating itself. Feminist critics have pointed out how horror often uses the home, a traditionally feminine space, as a site of violation. Here, however, the house becomes something more, a vessel for inherited nightmares, a place where the sins of the past infect the present. From a critical perspective, what makes this film endure is precisely its strangeness. The events defy convention, the themes blur into allegory, and the emotional beats resonate in ways that were not fully appreciated at the time. Each significant moment, the bus nightmare, Schneider's death, Grady's betrayal, the pool massacre, Lisa's kiss, the ambiguous ending, functions both as narrative spectacle and as metaphorical statement. Together, they create a film that is not simply a sequel, but a unique meditation on repression, identity, and survival. In the end, the film's critical legacy is defined not by its adherence to rules, but by its willingness to break them. Its events may have unsettled audiences in 1985, but they also carved a space for deeper readings, for interpretations that continue to spark debate decades later. The film frightens not because of what it shows, but because of what it suggests. That the real monster is not in our dreams, but in ourselves, in the parts of identity we fear, deny, or repress. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying truth of all. The story of how this film came into being is almost as surreal as the story it tells. On screen, it is a fevered tale of nightmares crossing into daylight, of possession and repression woven into a suburban landscape. But behind the scenes, it was something else entirely. A mixture of creative risks, production chaos, accidents that turned into iconic moments, and a cast and crew who sometimes had little idea just how strange their project would become. To step into the making of this film is to enter another kind of dream, one shaped not by scripted terror, but by clashing visions, unexpected improvisations, and a legacy no one on set could have predicted. The project began with urgency. After the staggering success of the first Nightmare, the studio, New Line Cinema, found itself desperate to keep momentum alive. They had survived financially because of the first film, and now they wanted lightning to strike again. The pressure to produce a sequel quickly meant that development moved at breakneck speed. A script was drafted by David Chaskin, whose ideas differed radically from those of Wes Craven. Craven himself had refused to return, believing the first film should remain a singular work, a complete nightmare with no need for continuation. His absence opened the door for a sequel that would diverge from the carefully crafted dream logic of the original. Jack Sholder, the director chosen for the job, was known for his efficiency, and that efficiency would define the entire production. Fast, focused, and willing to experiment. Casting brought its own quirks and surprises. Mark Patton, chosen to play Jesse Walsh, entered the production without fully grasping that he was stepping into history. Horror films of the time revolve around the archetype of the final girl, the young woman who survived by her resilience and resourcefulness. Here, however, the lead role was given to a young man, a decision that would shape not only the film's tone, but also its critical afterlife. Patton, a soft-spoken actor with a background in stage work, approached the role with earnestness. He brought to Jesse a fragility and intensity that would later be interpreted through lenses far beyond what anyone on set likely imagined. For Patton himself, a closeted gay man navigating the homophobic climate of Hollywood in the mid-1980s, the role carried layers of resonance he would only fully reckon with decades later. Kim Myers, cast as Lisa, was brand new to the screen. With her wide eyes and calm determination, she was chosen partly because she reminded producers of a young Meryl Streep. For her, the shoot was a whirlwind introduction to Hollywood, full of long nights, chaotic effects, and surreal sequences where she found herself pleading with a monster inside a flaming boiler room. Robert Rusler, who played Grady, brought a cocky energy to his role that made his character's eventual intimacy with Jesse all the more striking. And Marshall Bell, cast as the gym teacher Coach Schneider, agreed to one of the most bizarre death scenes in horror cinema without fully realizing what he was signing up for. Robert Englund, returning as the nightmare figure, had by this point already cemented himself as an icon. His makeup process remained grueling, with hours spent in the chair each day as latex prosthetics and paint transformed his face into a mask of scarred menace. Englund, ever the professional, embraced the discomfort, often using it to fuel his performance. Between takes, though, he was known for his humor, cracking jokes in full costume and startling unsuspecting crew members who would turn a corner only to find themselves face-to-face with the monster himself, lounging with a coffee cup. The shoot itself was filled with strange moments that seemed to blur the line between fiction and reality. The house, already famous from the first film, returned as a set piece, its suburban facade now layered with the weight of history. Shooting inside it gave the cast a sense of déjà vu, even for those who hadn't worked on the original. The heat of the house became its own challenge. Many scenes required crew to work under sweltering conditions, and Patton in particular was drenched in sweat not just for character, but because the set itself was suffocating. Fans may remember Jesse's constant perspiration as symbolic, But behind the scenes, it was also simply practical. The actor could not escape the oppressive heat of lights, prosthetics, and long hours. One of the strangest behind-the-scenes stories comes from the filming of Coach Schneider's death. The sequence begins in a leather bar, where Jesse encounters his gym teacher before being dragged into the showers for a surreal, homoerotic execution. For Marshall Bell, this was his first major film role, and he later admitted that he had no idea how strange it would be. Bound by ropes, stripped, and whipped by unseen forces, Bell endured hours of discomfort while crew members tried to choreograph chaos. Water poured across the tiles, lights reflected off steam, and the actor stood vulnerable under the scrutiny of cameras. The crew, half embarrassed and half amused, whispered among themselves about the oddness of the scene. Bell himself took it in stride, later joking that he'd survived one of the most unforgettable deaths in the franchise. Then there was the infamous pool party massacre. The decision to bring the monster into waking life, visible to dozens of teenagers, required a logistical circus. Extras crowded the backyard, explosions were staged with pyrotechnics, and Englund, encased in his heavy prosthetics, stalked through the set as flames roared around him. The chaos spilled beyond the production itself. Neighbors reportedly called the police, believing something had gone horribly wrong. Crew members scrambled to reassure them that it was only a film, though from the outside it must have looked like real carnage erupting in a quiet suburban yard. For the extras, the night shoot was both terrifying and exhilarating, many of them later recalling how surreal it felt to watch the monster stride among them, shouting lines improvised on the spot. Englund himself admitted that this was one of the hardest sequences he had ever filmed, the sheer heat and disorder pushing everyone to their limits. The transformation scenes, where Jesse's body splits to allow the nightmare figure to emerge, were triumphs of practical effects, but nightmares for the actors involved. Patton wore heavy prosthetics that restricted his breathing, while puppeteers manipulated mechanical claws breaking through skin-like latex. The effect was grotesque and convincing, but the process was exhausting. Patton later recalled how suffocating the prosthetics felt, how he emerged from takes drenched, gasping for air, his exhaustion indistinguishable from Jesse's torment. The crew, impressed by his endurance, admitted that the physical strain added authenticity to his performance. What looked terrifying on screen was even more grueling in reality. Jack Sholder, the director, had his own peculiar approach to filmmaking. Unlike Craven, who emphasized atmosphere and symbolism, Sholder preferred directness and efficiency. He was known for keeping the shoot moving at a rapid pace, rarely indulging in second takes unless absolutely necessary. Some crew members admired his speed, others felt it sacrificed nuance. His direction, combined with Chaskin's script, created a film that felt more fever dream than structured nightmare, more physical possession than surreal slashing. At the time, critics lambasted this as incoherence. Decades later, however, scholars reinterpreted it as experimentation, a daring attempt to explore horror from a different angle. The queer subtext, so heavily debated in later years, was a source of quiet tension during production. Patton, aware of his own identity and the way the camera seemed to linger on him, sensed the undertones but felt unable to speak openly in Hollywood's climate. Chaskin, the screenwriter, initially denied writing with queer themes in mind, only to later admit that he had deliberately woven them into the script as metaphor. For years, Patton bore the brunt of criticism, accused of overplaying the subtext, when in reality it had been built into the bones of the narrative. Behind the scenes, this created an atmosphere of uncertainty. Some crew whispered knowingly about the film's undertones, while others treated it as just another horror sequel. The ambiguity shaped the film's legacy, turning it into one of the most discussed queer-coded texts in horror history. Even the smallest moments carried their own odd anecdotes. The exploding parakeet sequence, often cited as one of the strangest in the film, was the result of a special effects experiment gone wrong. The crew attempted to stage the death of the family bird with mechanical rigs and pyrotechnics, but the effect looked less terrifying than absurd. On set, cast members struggled to keep straight faces as feathers scattered across the room. Audiences later laughed at the scene, and it became a point of ridicule among critics. Yet, strangely, this absurdity only deepened the film's cult appeal, adding to its reputation as a surreal oddity in the franchise. The rushed schedule meant that editing became a frantic race to assemble coherence from chaos. Scenes were trimmed, rearranged, and sometimes left ambiguous simply because there was no time to polish them. The ending, with its return to the school bus and sudden eruption of unease, was partly a creative choice and partly a necessity, shaped by the need to provide both resolution and a hook for sequels. Cast members themselves were unsure how to interpret it, some believing Jesse was free, others convinced the nightmare had only begun again. Despite the exhaustion and confusion, the set was not without its moments of camaraderie. Patton, Myers, and Rusler grew close during filming, often sharing late-night meals after long shoots. Englund, ever the Joker, kept spirits up with his humor, sometimes startling extras by sneaking up on them in full costume. Crew members bonded over the absurdity of their tasks, whether rigging exploding birds, dragging ropes across locker rooms, or painting gallons of fake blood onto sets. For many, the strangeness of the production became its charm, a shared memory of chaos that they would carry long after the film wrapped. Looking back now, the production of this film reads like an allegory in itself. It was rushed into existence, misunderstood upon release, ridiculed for its absurdities, and yet, in time, embraced for the very strangeness that once doomed it. The behind-the-scenes stories, the awkward shower death, the chaotic pool party, the suffocating prosthetics, the exploding bird, are not just trivia. They are part of the film's texture, part of why it feels so feverish, so unlike anything else in the franchise. What was once dismissed as failure has become legend. The film's production is now studied as a case of accidental brilliance, where limitations, chaos, and unspoken subtext created a work that resonates decades later. Its fun facts are not distractions. They're the fingerprints of a messy human process, reminders that films are not made by machines, but by people, sweaty, exhausted, laughing, arguing people, who sometimes create something unforgettable without realizing it at the time. And so the film, both on screen and behind the scenes, stands as a strange, fascinating artifact. It tells us that nightmares are not confined to dreams, that repression finds its way to the surface, and that even the oddest, most chaotic productions can leave a legacy. The crew may have thought they were simply making a quick sequel, but what they made instead was a piece of horror history, haunted not only by its monster, but by the strangeness of its own creation. What lingers most in memory after the film is not only its characters, or even its infamous monster, but the spaces it inhabits, the textures of its world, the way light and shadow press against every frame. The settings are not passive. They are living organisms, shifting, breathing, and shaping the narrative as much as any line of dialogue. To speak of this film is to speak of houses that sweat under unbearable heat, of school hallways that turn from mundane to labyrinthine, of backyards that erupt into scenes of chaos, of boiler rooms that glow like gateways to hell. These settings are not merely backdrops. They are metaphors, extensions of the story's themes of repression, possession, and transformation. Through them, the film communicates what words cannot, using cinematography and visual design to etch fear directly into atmosphere. The house where Jesse and his family live is perhaps the most central setting, and it is no ordinary home. It is the same suburban house that belonged to Nancy in the earlier nightmare, a house already soaked with memory, carrying the weight of past horrors. From the outside, it looks ordinary enough. 2 stories, tidy lawn, white picket trim. But inside, its very walls seem to pulse with unease. Critics have often pointed out how horror films transform domestic space into uncanny terrain, and this house is a perfect example. Bedrooms are supposed to be sanctuaries, kitchens places of comfort, basements spaces of storage and safety. Here, they are inverted. The kitchen is where toasters burst into flames without being plugged in. The bedroom is where Jesse writhes in sweat, unable to rest. The basement, where the furnace glows with unnatural heat, becomes a portal to the nightmare, a place where Jesse hears whispers no one else can hear. The cinematography emphasizes this unease. Ordinary rooms are filmed at odd angles, ceilings seeming lower than they should be, shadows stretching too far into corners. Light flickers where it should be steady, creating the impression that the house itself is alive. The oppressive heat, a recurring motif, is captured through close-ups of Jesse's sweat, through hazy lighting that makes the air seem heavy, through the way curtains hang limp against sealed windows. The house becomes a metaphor for repression. It is a place where secrets smolder, where heat builds until it must escape, where appearances of suburban normalcy conceal rot underneath. School settings, too, are transformed. The high school Jesse attends is, on the surface, an ordinary 1980s American school, filled with lockers, classrooms, and gyms. But the film bends these spaces, turning them into sites of terror. In one sequence, the locker room becomes the stage for Jesse's strange and violent encounter with Coach Schneider. The ordinary echo of showers against tile transforms into something uncanny, while the cinematography exaggerates the gleam of wet surfaces and the claustrophobia of the space. The gym, which should be a place of physical vitality, becomes oppressive, its lighting stark, its lines of authority symbolized in Schneider's domineering figure. Classrooms, too, are lit in ways that drain them of vitality, casting students in sterile tones, making the ordinary routine of education feel distant and unreal. Through these choices, the film suggests that no space of adolescence, whether home or school, is immune to corruption. Perhaps the most infamous setting of the film is the backyard pool party, a location that in another genre might symbolize freedom, celebration, and youthful joy. Here it becomes a nightmare. The suburban backyard, complete with barbecue, lounge chairs, and a shimmering pool, shifts violently into a landscape of chaos. Flames erupt, fences are torn down as panicked teenagers scramble for safety, and the pool itself becomes a mirror for horror, reflecting firelight and panic in equal measure. Cinematically, this sequence is lit with contrasts. The cool blue of the water against the searing orange of flames, the strobe of sudden explosions against the darkness of night. The camera moves frantically, capturing the panic of the crowd, while anchoring its gaze on the figure who has stepped fully into waking life. Critics often remark on how unsettling this scene remains, not only because it violates the franchise's established rules, but because it transforms a quintessential image of suburban leisure into one of horror. The setting itself enhances the allegory. Desire, repression, and fear erupt not in private, but in public, spilling into the spaces of social life. Yet no setting is more iconic, more symbolically loaded than the boiler room. The industrial underworld of pipes, chains, and fire returns as the ultimate nightmare space. If the house represents repression at the surface, the boiler room represents the unconscious itself, the hidden, fiery depths where repressed desires and fears take form. Lit with harsh orange glow, filled with smoke and hissing steam, the boiler room looks less like a practical location and more like a vision of hell. Cinematography here is claustrophobic, with low angles, tilted frames, and heavy shadows. The camera lingers on details, dripping pipes, sparks from unseen machinery, the glow of fire reflecting on wet surfaces. Every shot communicates menace, as though the space itself conspires against the characters. The boiler room is not simply the lair of the monster. It is a metaphor for Jesse's psyche. Critics have noted how its oppressive heat mirrors Jesse's own constant sweating, how its confined passages mirror his lack of escape, how its machinery mirrors the mechanical, unstoppable nature of repression. When Lisa confronts the monster in this space, the symbolism deepens. She is not only descending into a physical lair, but into Jesse's subconscious, into the place where fear and desire have fused. The setting elevates the confrontation, making it not only physical, but psychological, not only narrative but allegorical. Beyond these central locations, smaller settings play their part in shaping atmosphere. The opening dream sequence on the school bus, with its shift from suburban streets to barren wasteland, demonstrates the film's ability to turn ordinary settings into landscapes of dread. The leather bar, where Jesse encounters Schneider, adds another layer. Dimly lit, neon glowing faintly against darkness, filled with figures who represent forbidden desire. The cinematography here emphasizes the surreal, the uncanny blending of Jesse's world with something unfamiliar and dangerous. Even minor spaces, like Jesse's bedroom, with its posters and clutter, are filmed with such intensity that they feel alien. Shadows move where they shouldn't, curtains ripple without cause, and the room itself seems to betray its inhabitant. Lighting is perhaps the most powerful cinematic element throughout. Daylight sequences are often washed out, sterile, offering no warmth or safety. Night sequences, by contrast, are drenched in blues and oranges, colors that clash violently to create unease. The oppressive heat is conveyed not only through Jesse's sweat, but through the way light seems to shimmer against surfaces, as though the air itself is burning. At the pool party, the flames illuminate terrified faces in stark flashes, creating a tableau of panic. In the boiler room, firelight flickers against metal, casting long, distorted shadows. Light and shadow here are not neutral. They are weapons shaping mood, amplifying terror, and symbolizing the thin line between repression and eruption. Sound design complements the settings, turning them into auditory landscapes as well as visual ones. The hiss of the boiler room, the crackle of flames in the backyard, the echo of water against tile in the shower, the screech of claws against metal, all create an atmosphere where space itself seems alive. Even silence is weaponized. The absence of sound in Jesse's house late at night, the stillness before an eruption of chaos at the pool party, the hushed dread before Lisa enters the boiler room. These auditory elements deepen the immersion, making each setting feel like a character in its own right. Then there was the exploding parakeet, a scene that has since become infamous among fans. The sequence, in which the family's pet bird erupts in feathers and chaos, was intended to symbolize the breakdown of domestic stability. On set, however, it played out with absurdity. The mechanical rig malfunctioned, sending feathers and debris flying in unintended directions. Actors struggled to keep straight faces as the scene dragged on. Crew members whispered about how ridiculous it looked, and many assumed it would be cut. To their surprise, it remained, forever cemented as one of the strangest moments in the franchise. The death of Coach Schneider brought another surreal challenge. Marshall Bell, cast as the domineering gym teacher, endured hours of filming in the locker room sequence where ropes whip across his body and he is dragged into the showers. For Bell, it was awkward and grueling, especially as he had to perform much of it restrained and vulnerable under hot lights. Crew members joked nervously about the scene's homoerotic undertones, while Bell himself tried to treat it with professionalism. Years later, he would laugh about how bizarre it felt at the time, admitting that he had little idea just how notorious the sequence would become. Perhaps the most chaotic shoot of all was the pool party massacre. Dozens of extras crowded the suburban backyard set, pyrotechnics exploded, and Englund, encased in heavy prosthetics, stalked among them under suffocating heat. The chaos spilled beyond the set itself. Neighbors, seeing flames erupt and hearing screams, called authorities, convinced a real emergency was unfolding. Crew members scrambled to explain that it was only a film, though to outsiders it must have looked like true carnage. For the extras, the night was unforgettable. Many later recounted the thrill of running from Englund as fireballs erupted around them. For Englund, the sequence was exhausting but exhilarating, a chance to fully embody the nightmare in waking life. Behind the scenes, tensions sometimes flared. The rushed schedule left little room for rest, and tempers occasionally snapped. Crew members grumbled about long hours, and actors felt pushed to their limits. Yet amid the frustration, there was also camaraderie. Patton, Myers, and Rusler bonded during late-night shoots, often sharing meals and jokes to ease the pressure. Englund's humor kept spirits light, and makeup artists, despite their grueling tasks, developed a sense of pride in their grotesque creations. The set, strange as it was, became a community, a group of people thrown together in chaos, united by the knowledge that they were making something unusual. One of the most surprising facts was how divided the cast and crew were about what they were creating. Some treated it as straightforward horror, others whispered about the queer subtext, while some dismissed it entirely as pulp. The ambiguity created a strange atmosphere. Was this film a serious allegory, an accidental comedy, or just another slasher? The truth lay somewhere in between, and that uncertainty gave the final product its peculiar tone. For Patton, the experience was transformative and painful. He carried the weight of being the franchise's first male lead, only to find himself later scapegoated for the film's queer undertones. At the time, though, he simply gave everything he had, throwing himself into the role with vulnerability that crew members later described as both brave and raw. Myers and Rusler supported him, unaware of the storm that would follow the film's release. Englund, meanwhile, reveled in the chaos, treating each day as an opportunity to push the character further into legend. The film wrapped quickly as it had been conceived. When the cast and crew dispersed, many assumed it would be remembered only as a rush